Hi there. In this video, we will continue our presentation about the forensic accounting and fraud examination. If you remember, in the previous part, we talked about the definition of fraud examination, the definition of forensic accounting, the relation between the two fields and auditing. And we said, to control the fraud examination and try to deter the fraud, we need to build up good corporate governance structure, starting by the board of directors, going down to the executive management, going down to the audit committee, internal audit, and then reviewed by external auditor at the end of the year. And the last part of my presentation, I talked about the issues that the external auditor has to work on during the auditing process. And then we talked about setting up the materiality level and then try to assess the risk. And here the auditor is planning to do this so that in the audit report, the auditor can issue different types of opinion. And if the management is doing good and doesn't need any further investigation, usually the management, they take unqualified opinion. So unqualified opinion, as you can see on the screen here, it's the best, which means that the management did a great job in setting up all the financial statements according to the US GAAP. If there is a scope limitation on the audit work, it means the management didn't support the auditor or did not provide all the information he needs, then the auditor can go for qualified opinion. Or if the management departed from the US GAAP without any clear explanation, it might go for qualified opinion. If the auditor found out there is a severe limitation for his scope or huge departure from the US GAAP, then the auditor can issue adverse opinion. And finally, if the auditor couldn't do his job, then the auditor will issue disclaimer. So those are the 4 different types of audit opinion. And usually when you take the audit class, then it discuss this one in more details. The next part we need to discuss it is the, I'm sorry, I just need to move this bar. Yep. Okay. The auditor here is following the statement of auditing standards number 99 when it comes to the area of fraud examination. What does it mean? It means that the auditor has to have a professional skepticism. It means the auditor will be licensed as a certified public accountant or fraud examining, because this will enhance his professional skepticism in searching for any kind of irregularities or anomalies among the numbers and try to see if there is any fraud happening. The second thing that the auditor has to keep in mind in compliance with SAS 99, that the auditor has to meet with the audit team before they run the audit, which we call it pre-audit fraud brainstorming. Usually the audit team, before they do any auditing work, they meet together to see where are the risky areas that they might face during the audit and what they should do if they find high risk in certain areas. Then the audit team will talk to the management, ask questions from the management, and this falls under the interviews with management. And finally, the auditor will design a test. So test designed to see if there is any fraud happening or not. The key issue between fraud and audit that the auditor might face is the intent. Because when the auditor is doing his routine work, he might find errors. And then the auditor has to have a skeptical mind to see if this error is innocent and doesn't have any intention, or it has intention behind it. Because if there is an intention, this would be the first step in fraud. Usually, there are steps the auditor should make it, and as you can see it on the screen, he has to discuss the issue of fraud, the risk of fraud with the team. So this one, we call it a staff discussion, and then get the information needed to identify the risk, whether it's high risk or medium risk or low risk. And once we identify the risk, we need to see what are the potential schemes considering the internal control. So when we identify the risk, we ask the next question: is there any control to reduce this risk? There might be good control, but there might be secretive agreement among multiple people to commit fraud, which we call it collusion. So we have to identify this one as well. And then we make a response to the assessment of the risk. It means the auditor with the audit team will say, yes, there is a high risk and there is a good control, but there might be a collusion here. So we have to see the response written and then evaluate the evidence we collect. Is this a reliable evidence or not reliable? Is this a sufficient evidence or not sufficient? So we have to evaluate the audit evidence, and then we communicate the fraud. How the auditor is communicating the fraud? If the fraud is small, the auditor will communicate it to the executive management and the audit committee. If the fraud is big, the auditor will report it to the audit committee without going to the executive management, because most of the time the executive management is involved in this fraud. And no matter what kind of fraud the auditor is finding, it has to report everything in writing, starting from step 1 up to step 7. So this is the role of the auditor in discovering, communicating, and reporting the fraud. The next one is the materiality. The auditor might find errors here and there during the process of auditing, but for the sake of convenience, because the auditor cannot review every transaction during the year, so we make a sample from the different transactions, and then we see if there is the error above materiality level, then we try to investigate it. If it's below, we ignore it. Why? Because if the fraud is small, the amount of time and fees the auditor is going to spend on the investigation might be much more than the amount of the fraud that was committed. So here we have to set up the materiality. The materiality, as you can see here, it's judgmental. It differs from one auditor to the other. The materiality is relative concept. So what it seems material for one auditor might be immaterial for another. So they have to set up the materiality level, and any illegal acts have no materiality threshold. It means if there is a fraud and there is an intention, then we have to investigate. But if there is an error and the error is below the materiality level, then we don't have to spend more time and effort for that. And the next one is qualitative versus quantitative aspect. When it comes to the area of fraud, we have to check everything for one reason. What seems to be a small fraud today, it might end up to be a big scandal in the future. So we have to trace the fraud and try to identify the fraudster before it becomes a big scandal and ends by bankruptcy or shutdown of the business. So this is what we mean by materiality. Now, the auditor here usually uses the professional judgment to set up the materiality. So we anticipate the potential reader of the information, which means who will be the reader of the financial statements. And the auditor has to act on behalf of the users. And the auditor also has to become a financial expert in identifying the problem, trying to disclose it clearly in the financial statements, because the auditor is serving the public interest for the first part. And for the second one is presenting his opinion to the audit committee. So the auditor has a major role, which is providing a fair assessment to the financial statements to the public and giving opinion to the management about their work. What is the problem with quantification? Here we focus on the assessment of the risk itself, which means that we try to differentiate between the error and the fraud. If it's error, we look at the quantity, the repetition of the error. If it's fraud, we look at each one significantly. So the quantification of the problem here, it goes into errors, but not fraud. Now we shift the gear from talking about the auditor and his assessment to the risk and his evaluation to the control and how much the control can deter or prevent the risk. Now let us go to the management. Why the management is committing fraud? The biggest part or the main reason, because the management need to get a bonus at the end of the year. The executive managements, they are looking for some earnings, which we call it earnings management at the end of the year. If the company didn't do well, if the net income is not really well, if the financial situation is not really promising, the first thing the board of directors will do is not to give the earning management anything for that year. So the management might take deliberate action to meet specific earning objectives for their own incentives. And here the auditor has to put the materiality threshold. How big is the fraud and how much the management is expecting to get behind this fraud, and then try to see where is the compliance with the financial principles and where is the non-compliance area and whether this will lead to fraud or not. So the auditor has to keep in mind the financial situations and how much return will come from a good financial situation to the management. And then try to analyze the financial statements properly to see if there is any manipulation to the numbers that will lead to earning managements at the end. The point now, how can we prevent the earning management from happening? It comes in the first part by the board of directors and the audit committee. Why that? Because here the primary responsibility of the board of directors and the audit committee is to supervise the management. So how can they supervise the management? They create the internal control department or internal audit department that runs a regular audit to make sure that the internal control is working properly. And this is what we mean by direct internal control. So the board of directors will nominate the audit committee. The audit committee will create the internal audit department, which will run a regular assessment to the internal control. And then the external control or the external auditor will come once a year to check if the whole operation is working properly or not. This way will deter the management, hopefully, from committing any fraud to get earning management at the end of the year. And here, the board of directors can follow one of different frameworks for the internal control. And the most popular one is used among all the public companies is COSO framework. The Committee of Sponsoring Organization, they build up a framework that includes 5 key items: control environment, risk assessment, internal control procedures, information and communication, and the monitoring. And this is what we mean in the second point here, internal control over financial reporting. We create this internal control to make sure that the financial statements are reliable, the operation is running effectively and efficiently, and there is compliance with rules and regulations. And the auditor here has to express his opinion on the internal control by the end of the year. The board of directors should walk the talk, as they say. So the board of directors themselves, they should not commit any fraud. And this is what we mean by tone at the top. They set the model example before the management and the employees by walking the talk. Number two, the board of directors should embrace anti-fraud programs, and they should maintain training to the management and the employees. So there should be a regular training happening to the management and the employees to make sure that they are aware of the rules and regulations, and hopefully this will prevent them from committing fraud. And then the board of directors has to become strict about tolerance for fraud. It means instituting a zero tolerance policy. If any fraud is discovered, the board of directors has to take immediate and severe action to put an example for everyone that fraud is not accepted. And also, the board of directors, they should protect the whistleblower if they hear anything, and they should take action on that. Now we come to the internal audit. So just to recap what I said, first I said we need to make the corporate governance structure that starts by the board of directors, and then it goes to the audit committee, then it goes to the internal audit department, and then the external auditor will come at the end of the year to do assessment, evaluation, and then communicate any findings to the audit committee. The last piece in the corporate governance structure is the internal auditor. The internal auditor, by the way, doesn't have to be an accountant, and it doesn't have to be an auditor. The internal auditor is a person that is aware of the operation, and this is what you can see here in the second one. Evaluate the segment, the product line, the division, the profitability, improve the internal productivity. And this is the role of the internal auditor. Make sure that the operation is running normally or running to the best possible way it could be. By default, because from the name you tell internal auditor, it could have a good background in auditing and accounting. Yes, it is. But I myself, I have seen some engineers, they can work as an internal auditor. As long as you get the good training and you are familiar with the financial statements, you can become an internal auditor. And there is a certification for internal auditor called CIA, Certified Internal Auditor. And it gives you all the information that the internal auditor should be aware of. The second point for the internal auditor is evaluation of the internal control. And this can tell you here that here we talk about the internal control over the financial reporting. But the internal auditor doesn't have to know everything in the financial reporting. The internal auditor needs to know, is there a good control or no control? And here you see the Institute of Internal Auditor is the institute that gives the certification for CIA, Certified Internal Auditor. And there is some statements issued by the IIA to guide the internal auditor in running the right process of auditing. So now we finished the corporate governance structure. Let us shift the gear to the fraudster. How the person or the organization or the group who are committing the fraud, they try to commit the fraud. And here you see, one point is that the audit committee might not be competent enough to discover the fraud, or they don't have good background about the employees or the other executive management. This might be one of the issues that encourage the people to commit fraud. If the managers at the high level of the corporate governance structure, they are not really competent in discovering the fraud and communicating the fraud and controlling the company, this might play a big role in creating fraudulent transactions. Many audit committee members, they receive compensation and stock options. And this also might be a reason for the audit committee to overlook some kind of weaknesses for the sake of getting some benefit out of it. So we have to be careful about the audit committee, their financial and industrial competencies in preventing any fraud transaction from being happen. As you can see here, package or process-oriented audits, it means the audit process is just a matter of a checking or filling in the blank or rubber stamp, as they say, but there is no actual audit. How we discovered the audit, how we find out an audit, number one, we should develop the skeptical mindset, which is asking why it happens. We cannot become happy with finding the information on documents. So if I find an invoice or a record or an account that has some problem, this should not be my only evidence. I should look for more evidence. And this is what it means by going beyond the documents in the first point. Number two, sheer size of fraud often brings house of cards down. So the small hint for the fraud can open up more issues about the whole transaction. And the key point that the auditor has to check all the time, is there a good internal control or not? If there is a good internal control, was it circumvented by a group of people, which we call it collusion, or it's not? And one of the things that can help the auditor to discover it is the professional skepticism, which is a skeptical mindset. And there might be a possibility of concealment, and so many auditors, by the way, they don't discover the fraud. So even if I mentioned all of this, there might be a chance that the fraudster make a good coverage for the transaction. And here we need to first check the red flags, which I will mention it soon, and assess the risk, if it's high risk or moderate or low risk. How can I trace the fraud? Nowadays, the social media can be a good tool, by the way, in the hand of the auditor or the fraud examiner to find the first hint about the fraud. Checking the social media of some employees, like the Facebook or the Twitter or the Instagram, can give you an idea about the personal lifestyle of the different people. So if I find a normal employee like an accountant, but when I check his Facebook or his social media, I find that he has Lamborghini. Come on, how can a small person who has a very limited salary is getting Lamborghini? There might be some legitimate reasons, but there might be also a fraud. So this is a good example to tell you that although the people might have normal photos on the social media, but before the eyes of the fraud examiner, these photos can deliver a message. So nowadays we use the social media as a tool to find out if there is any fraud or not. Number two, the fraud examiner or the auditor has to understand the business, the industry, the competition, the regulation, the assessment of the industry, and the trend of the company. When I say horizontal or vertical, it means the growth of the company horizontally over the years, vertically, the expansion of the company within 1 year. How much the company did in this year, and how much the company did over the years. The auditor has to check both of them to see if this is legitimate growth or not, and if there is a shrinkage, is there a legitimate reason or not? The last point in this presentation is the examiner has to check the environment of the internal control. And as you can see here, there are 7 principles for the internal control environment. The internal control environment here, it's the first pillar in COSO framework. We are not going to discuss COSO framework in this course because we discuss it in accounting information system class and in auditing class. But here for forensic accounting and fraud examiner, because it's strongly related to them, they have to become aware of what it should be done, because if it's not done, it means there is something going on. Number one, the fraud examiner has to check if there is some kind of commitment from the board of directors and the audit committee and the executive management for seeking integrity and ethical value. If the auditor or the examiner couldn't find that the company or the management is seeking integrity and ethical value, this might be the first point that there might be some fraud going on in the company. Number two, commitment to competency. What does it mean? It means, are the employees on those companies certified in their career? If they are medical doctor, do they have license? If they are accountant, do they have their CPAs? If they have attorneys, do they have license? Because having the license, it means you are competent enough to do the job. So there is commitment to competency and maintaining this competency by taking regular training. So the auditor has to check that there is regular training going on to the employees, and this can increase their competency and enhance their ethical value. Number three, how far the board of directors from the executive management? Are the board of directors dependent with the management? It means one of the executive management is a board member or not. If the board members are independent, it means all the board members are not part of the executive management. This will give the chance to the board to make the right control over the management. But imagine in some companies, the CEO of the company is the same as one of the board members or the chairman of the board. If the person is having the two positions, it means he will work for the best of the management rather than for the best of the shareholders. But if the board is away from the management, it will does the good job for the shareholders as a steward for the shareholders and representative for the management. And this is what we mean by the independence. And they will be able to create internal control and so on. Then we come down to the management. So first we talk about the board of directors, and then we talk about all the employees with their competency, then the independent of the board of directors, and here the management. Is the management taking an aggressive role in taking the financial success or not? Or they are very conservative? Because if the management turn out to become aggressive to make higher income, this might push them to make fraudulent transactions to make sure that they show at the end of the year high income. So the management attitude, philosophy, and operating style means they have either aggressive or conservative attitude, and this reflects on the financial performance at the end of the year. The organizational structure number 5, it talks about every employee should know who is above him, to whom he's reporting, and who is under his supervision. So we should know the organizational hierarchy, who will be on the top of the ladder, responsible for whom, and the person under him, like the department manager, is reporting to whom and controlling whom. This actually, if we know the line of authority in the company and the responsibilities of the job, this will give a fair playground for everyone to know the limits of his or her job. Communications about the importance of the internal control through policies, through training, that everyone in the company is aware of the internal control. And finally, the human resource policy should recruit the right person, train the right person, retain the right person, and discipline the one who made any fraudulent transactions. So the HR department is playing a big role to set up the standard and discipline anyone who's not in compliance with the standard. This is in brief what I want to talk about the different structure. Who are the players in the fraud examination process? First, we need to know the corporate governance structure, starting by the board, the audit committee, the executive management, the employees, the internal auditor, and from outside, we have the external audit. And then the fraudster itself, he himself, the fraudster, might commit fraud if the audit committee is not really competent and if the internal control is really weak. And how can we make the internal control strong? We need to control or build up the good environment for the internal control. In the next presentation, I will talk about the red flags that the auditor or the fraud examiner will go through it to investigate or start his investigation process about any fraud. I hope you find this presentation useful. And as always, I welcome your questions, your suggestion on this presentation. Thank you. Bye-bye.